Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera. Anda sedang menonton Niaga AWANI bersama saya Najib Arif dan kita akan mulakan dengan perbincangan topik-topik yang berkaitan dengan perkembangan dunia dan juga tempatan. So we're going to start our Niaga AWANI this morning with discussion on one of the most consequential developments in global trade policy. Yesterday, US President Donald Trump announced 25% tariffs on Iran's trade partners, a move that has sent shockwaves through international markets and also diplomatic circles. And of course, this decision comes against a backdrop of long-standing US sanctions on Iran and moral police character US is trying to play in the context of anti-government protest that is currently happening across Iran. And to unpack these issues, we are joined by David Stepat, Country Director for Singapore at Dazon Shira & Associates, an expert in cross-border trade and investment strategies across Asia. David, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with a simple question. Does he has the guts to implement this, and what does this mean? And a move tells us about Washington's evolving strategy towards Iran and its trade partners. Is this a tactical escalation or a part of broader geopolitical play?
Thanks for having me, Najib. Great question. So definitely the Trump administration has the guts to implement this. We've seen this. However, I think there are practical implications here, right? So first of all, how is this defined? It was very vaguely defined. Is it countries that import from Iran? Is it countries that export to Iran? If it's both, we're talking about 120 plus countries that trade with Iran to varying degrees. The largest trading partners are China, India, Turkey, regional countries in the Middle East like the UAE, Iraq. So how would this be implemented, right? Like, then is this 25% tariff on top of the tariffs announced earlier last year? So for example, China is Iran's largest trading partner. Currently there's like around 30% tariffs on average on Chinese goods by the US. So will this 25% be on top of existing tariffs? China already announced that they are not willing to accept this. So they will probably prepare some kind of countermeasure if this were actually implemented. Then, of course, we can also look at Venezuela. Like last year, the Trump administration also threatened 25% tariffs on countries that buy Venezuelan oil. But this was actually never implemented. But despite this, the US achieved its goals in Venezuela by changing the leadership there. Of course, long-term implications we have to see. I think tariffs are just one of the many tools at the disposal of the Trump administration. You will see them take, let's say, like a more aggressive role in international politics than previous administrations, and leveraging tools like tariffs, but also military intervention, for example, or covert operations. So I think we will see more of this. But specifically for tariffs, just because there's so many technical issues, it would take a lot of resources for the US to determine what countries are trading with Iran. How could they implement these tariffs, right? Some large trading partners like China may push back hard. They may limit access to rare earth elements, for example, like they have in the past. So the Trump administration also there had to step down from extreme tariff measures. So right now it's an announcement. Whether it will be implemented, we have to see. And the US also has other options at its disposal.
David, could these tariffs, accelerate Iran's pivot towards China and also Russia? And what does, that mean for global power realignment that we are currently seeing?
Well, right now, Iran is very much aligned with China and Russia. I understand that these protests are probably the most serious in the last couple of years. And the US is pushing hard for regime change. They have shown the ability to interfere in other countries. So I think here we would have to see how far the Trump administration wants to go. I think all options are on the table, militarily, economically. I don't think it will push Iran further into the corner of China and Russia than it already has. Actually, I think this may be a turning point for the regime. Not sure if they can stay in power with this much pressure applied. But again, this would also depend on how much pressure the US is applying, what options they take. So just economically probably won't have as much of an impact as military options or perhaps even covert operations or political support by the US. So we really have to see how this plays out.
David, help us to understand from the geoeconomic standpoint, how do these tariffs compare to traditional sanctions in terms of achieving, policy goals without destabilizing global markets?
Well, it doesn't. Like, this is fairly destabilizing. Like, with a lot of announcement by the Trump administration, these things get announced first. It seems like there wasn't a lot of thinking on actually how will this be implemented. There's a strong announcement that says, like, any country that deals with them will face our wrath. That's basically what it says. This announcement by itself may already lead to some change. So some nations may think twice before they are dealing with Iran, for example, if they are smaller. If they are larger and Iran is important to them, for example, like China, they may just push back, right? I think this depends really on the countries we are talking about. Global markets don't like uncertainty. And this is, again, one of those things where I think we will see a lot of uncertainty because just the practical implications here are that this is not easily implemented. And we would have to see how any tariffs, if they even are implemented, would be approached during the actual implementation. For example, China buys, I think, the bulk of Iranian oil. This is shipped to China via a fleet of shadow tankers, murky ownership. They're difficult to track. So, and all the clearing is done in Chinese yuan, not US dollars. So how would the US police this? I've seen from Venezuela that they are capturing oil tankers, but here with China and Iran, I think this would be on a larger scale. So not sure how the US would implement any kind of tariffs announcements or sanctions on countries dealing with Iran. So I think for now this remains a threat with limited impact.
Let's just put a situation. Let's just assume that this tariff takes effect. For instance, what sectors do you think, and maybe supply chains as well, are most vulnerable to disruption from these tariffs? Particularly, we're talking about energy and maybe petrochemicals.
As far as Iranian oil is concerned, yes, but this also goes beyond that, right? Iran imports a lot of agricultural products, right? Like from markets like India, for example. So it depends really on if this would be implemented and for how long. At the moment, I really think it wouldn't be, just because in practice this would be very complicated. And the US has already shown that they wouldn't do this, for example, like with Venezuela, where this threat was also on the table in March last year, but they actually didn't follow through.
Yeah, I know China is the biggest trading partner for Iran, but for developing nations that trading with Iran, what are the immediate economic risks? Currency volatility, the volatility of economy itself, the trade volatility as well, investment flight maybe. But what kind of risk do you foresee based on this development?
So I think, like I said, Iran trades with roughly 120 countries, right? Like some major economies would probably see a larger impact, like Turkey, for example, China, but China has the power to push back. So not sure if this would actually even be implemented on China. And then we have smaller economies that may sell certain niche products, pharmaceuticals, machinery. So here, again, also limited impact. If these countries were really worried about being tariffed by the US. I think the US could apply a lot of pressure. So they then may just divest from dealing with Iran until it's clearer, or they may continue to deal with them until they see that further up the food chain, like with the larger economies, there's actually that the US is actually implementing this, right? Like, so I think smaller economies will just adopt a wait and see approach right now.
Yeah, David, and also the whole situation is what we've seen now is developing countries, ASEAN, for instance, is vulnerable to a certain extent in terms of having to face secondary sanctions in that sense. But how should ASEAN countries balance in terms of energy security and trade diversification, while at the same time avoiding exposure to these secondary sanctions?
Excellent question. So I think this goes also back to when US tariffs globally were announced last year, right? Diversify, right? Diversify within the region. Make sure you do not get all your energy supply from a single country. Make sure you don't sell all your goods to a single country. So more inter-ASEAN trade, for example, but also trade with other economies, whether that is the EU, South America, Japan. You cannot put all your eggs in one basket.
Mm-hmm. And I have to ask this because whether I'm not sure whether this is happening or not, but could this push smaller economies, to adopt alternative payment systems or digital currencies to bypass US financial dominance in that sense? Because we've seen a few developments that requires us to go through the US financial dominance in terms of the payment systems. But you see that this could trigger another payment systems or digital currencies in that sense?
Well, there's a reason that the US dollar is a global reserve currency. So any kind of dealings with alternative payment methods, whether that is cryptocurrency or other financial instruments or other currencies, I think would be limited because there's structural issues with this. So I wouldn't expect this to have a large impact. Let's not forget the United States is the largest economy in the world. A lot of countries still want to deal with them, and the US dollar is basically the backbone of the world economy for now. I mean, we have seen some signs that this may change. The Trump administration has taken an aggressive legal stance against the head of the Federal Reserve. So we have to see how that plays out, because the entire system is underwritten on the basis that the Federal Reserve is independent. And this kind of independence is actually what helped the US and especially the US dollar become so important for the world economy. Now, if this were to change, and this is just speculation, sure, we may see other currencies rise, but also again to a limited extent.
Mm-hmm. And my last question, of course, there's a lot of unilateral measures by the US itself, and of course, unilateral tariffs like this maybe risk undermining multilateral trade frameworks under WTO, for instance, and accelerating a fragmented global economic order that is currently happening. But how do you foresee this will be, at least for the next couple of years?
So there's a lot of uncertainty right now, I think, for all economies globally. I don't think there's any exceptions, right? Traditional US allies are worried about some of the steps the US is taking in international policy. Look at Greenland and Denmark, for example. If the US were to take Greenland by force, militarily occupy it, that would actually spell out the end for NATO and the transatlantic security cooperation that the US and Europe have enjoyed since the end of the Second World War. So it seems like the Trump administration is very willing to just question that status, and they don't really seem to care what the impact with their closest allies is. Likewise, the US now doesn't seem to mind throwing its weight around in global affairs, right? Like, so you've seen Venezuela and Iran how they deal with China, and then also by extension Southeast Asia, where you had countries that actually have a trade surplus with the US, but they still get tariffed, right? Like it seems like the US doesn't really care about what any kind of backlash is. From a policy perspective, and this is just my personal opinion, I think this is not sustainable, because if you are not seen as a trusted partner, then countries will want to reduce dependencies on you, because you're kind of a wild card, right? You don't know what could happen. And then looking at some of the examples now, countries would probably want to protect their interests and be less vulnerable to any kind of like policy or economic threats. So we would see more diversification, and then also, of course, I think a reduction of trade with the US, trade deals, while countries try to counter this. But then again, also the US is a parliamentary democracy, so the government will change again in 3 years, and then maybe the new administration is going to roll back some of these policies. So we don't know at the moment.
Yep.